everybody. Welcome. How's everybody doing today? Let me know in the chat where you're watching from. While you're doing that, we'll go ahead and show the quick intro, and then we'll get right on started with talking about our special needs kids. Hey, welcome, Natalie. Natalie's from Phoenix, Arizona. And then we have Maria from Houston. Welcome, both of you. And for those who are Catalina is from Boston. And for those of you who are going to watch on the replay, let us know in the chat as well where you're watching the replay from. So welcome everybody to today's Immediate Immersion Live. It's Monday. We're going to have a great week. I just know it. And today we're going to talk about our special needs kids. Now, let me start off by saying I am not an expert on special ed in any way, shape, or form. I don't have any special training outside of my standard credential, but in my 20 years, I've worked with hundreds and hundreds of special needs kids, and some of them are my favorite kids to work with. And so I just wanted to talk about how we can help these kids become more successful in our classrooms, maybe collaborate, have a few ideas that you may have used or tried and have worked for you. So it's going to be kind of a collaboration time. I have some ideas and what's worked for me and a couple things I want to talk about before we get to that collaboration part, which will be at the end. But I'm excited to talk about this because this is an area that is near and dear to my heart. When I first started teaching over 20 years ago, I was only part-time. I was hired for 2 periods. And I subbed for the other half of the day. And I often would sub in a special needs history class. And those kids were amazing. They really wanted to learn. We just had to find out how they learned so that we could teach them in the right way that was right for them. And I broke everything down. I mean, the lesson plans were there and I had to actually teach. They were expecting me to actually teach things. So when the kids were supposed to be reading the chapter, I'm reading the chapter, and then I would try to explain it. I remember one day I was explaining the Electoral College to special needs. This is high school, obviously. The Electoral College to them, and the aide that was in the room said that I explained it better than the regular teacher did to that class. So I love these kids, and these kids always sought me out on campus when they saw me. They had great hearts, great minds. We just had to find a way to teach them. Because in the American system, at least, we are in a cookie cutter system. We are in a system that the one size fits most. But our special needs kids fall outside of this group. So there is a need. There is a need for us to learn what it is that they need so that we can help them be successful. And that's kind of the whole reason why I wanted to talk about this today. Some other people asked for it, and I thought this is a really good topic because we have these kids in our classrooms and we want them to be successful. And we can't use the moniker that people say they can't learn a language. That's not true because most of my special needs kids can communicate in at least one language. So if they can acquire one language, they can acquire 2 and 3 and 4. They can't learn a language, but no human really can. And teaching them through textbook almost always ends in failure with these particular kids. So let's go ahead and talk about what's fair. This is something else that I wanted to mention. And Michelle Whaley couldn't be here live because she's still teaching. She teaches in Alaska. She's going to watch the replay and add any of her own thoughts as well. But one thing she did want me to express, and I 100% agree with her, is what we're doing for our special needs kids is not just for them. It's overall good teaching that helps all students. So if we slow down to make it more comprehensible for our special needs students, then we're helping all of the students, not just our special needs. The adaptations and the modifications that we do in our classroom aren't just for our special needs kids. Yes, we're targeting them for those modifications or accommodations, but all the kids will benefit. And here's a story that I like to share about that. In one of my Spanish classes, when I started when I was first starting teaching, I think it was maybe my third year of teaching. And I had a kid, and I didn't have any idea, and I know they don't call it this anymore, but I had no idea what Asperger's was. I knew about autism, but I really didn't know what that was either. It was the beginning of my teaching career. I really didn't have much idea. I grew up in the 80s, and nobody talked about autism or dyslexia or any of those learning disabilities or social emotional disabilities. So I had this kid in my class. He was a great kid. And he did things unusually. And I really didn't know how to handle it because I had never experienced this before. He was a freshman, so he was about 14, 14-ish, around that age. And he would come in and he would give me a hug, but he would put his head in my crotch, kind of like kids do. But kids do it because they're not tall enough to reach above the crotch. But he would kind of bend down. That's kind of where he was. When we sang, he sang, like a elementary school kid would sing. Being a little off on the singing. He couldn't function in my classroom because we didn't have a textbook. That really bothered him. It almost put him into a panic attack about not having a textbook, because the way he learned to survive in school was reading the chapter, memorizing as much of the chapter as possible, doing the comprehension questions at the end of the chapter, and succeeding. And he made it all the way to freshman year with no diagnosis of anything. Because in the state of California, if your aptitude matches your ability, then they don't do any testing. They don't do anything. Even though the parent said, there are things that are off with our child and we don't know what they are. Can you help us? And because he got good grades all the way through school, they said, he's performing fine. He needs no assistance. He learned how to adapt. But now come my class, teaching with comprehensible input. We did not have a textbook for him to rely on, for him to memorize. And he literally asked questions every 30 seconds. And normally with a kid, you can say, can you hold on your question just 1 minute? Let me finish my thought. He couldn't function that way. His brain actually stopped and wouldn't process any more information until the question was answered. Well, oh my gosh, every 30 seconds. I mean, all of these were on topic, great questions. None of them were, bad questions. But there were just so many of them, I wasn't getting through the lesson. So I had another student who volunteered. He had Tourette's. And he was labeled as a bad kid in most of his classes. I enjoyed him. I never had a problem with him. But he said he would answer as many of the questions as possible for the kid. And the kid would only raise his hand if neither one of them knew the answer. So that helped a little bit. So now I had questions about every 2 minutes instead of every 30 seconds. That was in my 5th period class. And we never, the entire year, made it through an entire lesson. Now, why am I telling this story? Because I had to slow down for this class to make it comprehensible for this kid, to answer all of his questions so that he could process the language. So it made me go extremely slow. And that's why we never got through any of the curriculum. But because of that, because of my going so slow, taking the time to answer all of his questions, working extremely hard to make sure it was comprehensible to him, it made all of the class more successful, not just him. The class averages in that class were higher than all of my other classes. And that was because he forced me to go slower, and by my having to answer all of his questions, made me go even slower than that. And so the point of that story is that what we do for one student or two students or even three students isn't just for them. It helps everybody in the classroom. And so we really need to think about that when we're doing that. And to let you know how it all turned out for this kid, he's now a doctor in Southern California. Amazing young gentleman. Not so young anymore. He's probably in his 30s. But when I moved to Vegas and I left him, him and his family came to visit me and thank me because, oh, by the way, he got diagnosed that year as needing services for high-functioning autism. Back then, this was the early 2000s, they still called it Asperger's, and he qualified for all that. But it was only because of my class that he finally got the diagnosis and the help that he needed. So the parents came and visited me in Vegas. We went out to dinner together, and then I saw the body exhibit with the student. It was really amazing to see him a little bit grown up. I think he was still in high school at the time, but I know I keep in contact with him on Facebook. He's an amazing kid, and he's a doctor in Southern California. So what we do in the classroom really does have potential to be a long-term effect. Another thing I want to talk about being fair, kids and even teachers don't really understand what an accommodation or a modification is for a kid. What we're trying to do is not give them superpowers, but just negate whatever their disability is, just negate it. And the best way that I can explain it so that people understand what it is, because even when parents say, oh, I don't want my kid to have a 504 or an IEP because they think it's a stigma, I explain to them this in this way, that glasses are like an IEP or a 504. If someone is lacking in vision because they can't see the board or they can't read the book in front of them because their vision is bad, we don't give them X-ray vision. We don't give them super powerful vision. We do just enough to correct the deficiency, to bring them as close to 20/20 as we possibly can, and nothing more. And that's what we need to do for our special needs kids. And one size does not fit all. Sorry, really thirsty. One size doesn't fit all. What works for one kid may not work for another, even if they have a similar disability or diagnosis. So you've got to figure out what the issue is and what is the minimum amount. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean, I don't want to go above to give them an advantage. What's the minimum amount that I can level the playing field? Another option would be when you're talking about height with kids. If the viewing point over the fence, if they're going to look over the fence at something, they need to all be at this height. But not all kids are at that height. So I give them a stool to stand on that doesn't make them way taller than the fence, but just brings their eye levels above the fence so they can see. And for some kids, that's a bigger stepping stool, and other kids, it's a smaller stepping stool. But we're not trying to exceed and give them an advantage. And a lot of teachers think that, oh, these accommodations, these modifications, we're making things easier for those kids so they can succeed. That's not what we're doing. We're not lowering the standard. We don't want to lower the standard for these kids. What we want to do is we want to raise them up just enough to where, with the abilities that they do have, they can hit that standard. When we have kids who can't use their legs, I currently have 2 kids in wheelchairs this year. We don't give them superpowers. They can't jump high in these wheelchairs. They can't go super fast in these wheelchairs. It's just negating the problem that they can't use their legs, so it gives them locomotion. So think about, when we're doing these accommodations and modifications, that we're doing just enough to negate the issues that they're having, but not to give them an advantage over any other students. Does anybody have any comments or questions about those 2 topics so far? While you're thinking, I will go to the next topic. Just feel free to add your ideas as we go along. My next thing I always do with my special needs kids is I have a conversation with them. It's one thing to read the 504 or IEP plan. It's another thing to talk to the parents. It's yet another thing to talk about their casework with their caseworker. But I take all of that information, but I actually want to talk to the actual kid. I want them to voice to me what the issue is and how I can help. Sometimes they have very creative ideas that I never would have thought of to make their lives easier, to make it adapting. For example, my 2 wheelchair kids, they're awesome. One of them is named Otto, and he is very self-sufficient. He has his wheelchair, but he can move himself from his wheelchair to a chair and back again. He can zoom around the room. He can get around all the little corners and everything. He has no problem getting around the room. He used to have an aide, but last year he wasn't using his aide, so they reassigned her to somebody else because he's so self-sufficient. Even going to the bathroom, he doesn't need much assistance in that area. Sometimes he does, but most of the time he does not. So I don't have an assistant for him in my classroom. But my other wheelchair student, her name is Jewel, another amazing young lady. I asked her, because I have classroom jobs, and I didn't want to offend either one of them, so I pulled both of them aside and I asked, would it be helpful to have an assistant? Senorita Thornton, I will address your question in just a moment. It's an awesome question. So I asked them, would you like an assistant in your class? Because we have, reading materials, like you have to go get a book from a library or classroom library. Do you want someone to help get you that book? Not that she's not able, but maybe she's not can maneuver around the classroom as easily as somebody else. So when I talked to both of them, Otto said he didn't need an assistant. No, he was fine. But Jewel, she said, yes, please have someone help me. Like, when we have clipboards, to go to get a clipboard for her, or to turn in her paper. So she has to navigate the classroom so much. To go get the book from the class library and put it back. So all of those things, she wanted the assistant. So I had this conversation to ask them, not to embarrass them. I didn't want to put it on the paper for them to sign up for the jobs if they weren't okay with it. I didn't want to assume. So I talked with them. Another one, they had problems with reading and listening overall, with ADHD and reading comprehension, and they kept doing really, really poorly on multiple choice Scantron back in the day when we used Scantrons. And the student, I asked, well, what's going on here? How can I help you? They go, well, I understand what you're talking about or what I'm reading, but what I'm having a problem with is the Scantron. The bubbles confuse me. I get them mixed up and I don't follow the line right. And so if I could just write the answer out, I think I'll do better. So what? I thought a Scantron would have been easier, but no, they wanted to actually write the answer out. So for that kid, I gave them a blank paper. They wrote the answer out and did so much better. I would never have thought. I would have thought the whole issue was in comprehension when it really wasn't. It was they did have problems with comprehension. They had a learning disability that affected that. But the big hurdle in my class wasn't that. It was the mechanics of the assessment. So having these conversations are so very important. Now, Senorita Thornton says, do you leave notes about those students for the substitute? I go back and forth this. I like the talk to the students. Absolutely. So I have 3 things I give subs. In my sub folder, I have number 1, my seating charts for all the classes. Number 2, I have the lesson plan for that day. Now, I have had subs who've thrown out my lesson plan, saying they thought it was dumb and they weren't going to do it. So I don't just give the lesson plan to the sub. I have a class leader in each of my classes that I also give a sub plan to. If it was an unexpected sub day, I will email it to that student. They know that they're the class leader, and then that's their job to make sure the sub does what I ask them to do. Because there's usually a reason I don't give fluff work. So there's usually a reason why I'm asking them to do this. And the one time that this sub said it was dumb, that it was to prepare them for an assessment that was coming the next day, and they really needed to work on it. Or when the sub gives incorrect versions of my directions. So the kids have a copy. So if I say on there, and some subs follow us and some don't, all kids must turn in what they did that day, even if they weren't finished, because I want to see how far they got. Were they working the whole time? And then the sub will say, oh, you can take it home and work on it at home. That's not my instructions. So the kids have the instructions so they know, and then they can't say, well, the sub told us one thing and you told us the thing. They know to go by what I told them. So that's my second thing, is the sub plans. And my third thing are my sub notes. So Maria says, this is great. I'm in a bad internet spot. I will have to watch later. Thanks. No worries. So back to Senorita Thornton's question. So my third thing is my sub notes. So for each class, I will have notes on each particular class. I will list the overall characteristics of the class. Is it a chatty class? Is it a well-behaved class? The overall things. I will list any health problems, any 504s, and any IEPs. Now, I don't give them the actual form, but I will abbreviate what they need to know. So if it's a health issue, I will put allergic to all nuts. Student has EpiPen. Or EpiPen is in main office. Or asthma, self-controlled. Something like that. My 504s, I'll put that down in there. Student has ADHD. Student is dyslexic. Student is diabetic. Sometimes those are under health and sometimes they're under 504s. And then any IEP information that's pertinent. I'm not giving out all the information. If they've got math issues, I'm not doing math. I don't put anything in there. So I will put things that actually, preferred seating, those kind of things that, the sub needs to know to be able to do their job and be in compliance with the 504, the health plan, or the IEP. So that's what I'll put in there. I will also put any behavior issues. So if any kids regularly have behavior issues, in my first period, Senorita Thornton says, thanks, this is great. It helps a lot. Awesome. And my first period is really my behavior problem class. They have a lot of behavior issues. The class was designed that way to get the kids away from kids who don't have all these behavior issues and don't cause distractions in the regular classroom. So they're all in one classroom. And I have, kids who are not potty trained, literally in 8th grade, they wet their pants, to kids who stand in garbage cans and sing the ABCs out loud, to kids who can't stop cussing. I mean, I go to a truck stop and you will hear less cussing than one kid uses in one class period. To sexual gestures, to I have a kid who runs and escapes. So I have a lot of different issues. So I put those in there so the sub is not going in blind, that they think this class is just hunky-dory and they've got this problem. I had a very violent kid a few years ago. They got an entire paragraph dedicated to them, telling them the procedure. Don't confront the kid if there's an issue with the kid. Get the kids out of the classroom, take the walkie-talkie, and call for administration right away because this kid was violent. He's known for throwing desks, breaking windows, all kinds of different things. So I put those in my sub plans so that they are aware. I don't want my subs going in blind. This is not a tattletale type thing. It's only the information they need to be able to successfully do their job. It may have notes in there like, Tommy and Joey can't sit next to each other ever. Don't put them together. They can't work together in pairs because they don't work. Those types of things. So I have all three things, the what do you call it? The seating chart. The seating chart and the sub notes. My subfolders are like not a 3-ring binder, but those little clippy binders that have the little clips in them, the clasps. So those are permanently in there. And then in the folder part, I will put the lesson plan for the day. So that's there. It's a red folder. It's clearly labeled sub plans, and it's always in a spot so my people know. So I usually do my sub plans in advance. I rarely take an emergency day off, but if I do, I can email the next door teacher and they can put it in my folder for the sub to be all ready. But the sub notes are already there because I write them at the beginning of the year, and they are there and they stay there all year long. So thank you. That was an awesome question, Senorita Thornton. Okay. So any questions or comments that we have so far before we start to kind of collaborate a little bit and come up with some ideas? I can tell you some things that I do that have helped. While you're thinking about that, we'll talk about some of those ideas. I will tell you some of the things that I have done. Depending on, again, I don't want to give them a leg up. I just want to give them a leg so that everybody is on an equal playing ground. That's my goal. So what I do, one of the things I've done is on a listening or reading quiz, instead of modifying the quiz, I will let them have 3 attempts in the same class period on it. So, how does that work? So, I will give the quiz, and then I will grade their quiz. They know to bring me their quizzes right away when they finish. And I will grade it right then and there. I will mark which ones are wrong. And then I say, you've got 2 more chances. So go back to your desk, reread or re-listen, because I record them so they can listen on the earphones, and then fix the ones that are wrong. And then I come back, I check the ones that were wrong, Any that are still wrong, I will mark again, and I give them a third chance to try to fix the problem. And then I will give them the third attempted grade, whatever the grade is at the end of the 3 attempts. But I also note that it was modified, because we have to note that for our report cards, that if we do a modification, and that's a modification, it's not an accommodation, it's a modification. I'm modifying the format of the assessment for them. We have to mark it on the report card that we did that. Again, the standard is the same, but usually these kids have problems with ADHD. Let's say it's only ADHD, they have a problem with focusing on auditory stuff, I'm not going to do that for the reading quiz. It'll only be for the listening quiz. Or if they're dyslexic or have problems with word decoding and comprehension of written text, we'll just do it for the reading. But I want to level that playing field. So that's one thing. Another thing is a modification, especially for my ADHD kids, where I will give them a separate recording to listen to and a separate reading. It's the same reading, but they're broken down. Normally in my listening and reading, it's in a story format. So I'll tell the whole story twice, and then they answer the questions about the story. Or they read a story, and then they answer the questions about the story. But especially with ADHD kids, they have a hard time focusing that long for like 2 or 3 minutes than to be able to answer the 10 questions afterwards. So what I will do is I will break it up into chunks, whether it be textual because they're reading it or auditory because they're listening to it. And I'll read a portion of the same story, maybe 2 or 3 sentences. And then underneath that 2 or 3 sentences, I will put the questions that apply to those sentences. So if the first 3 sentences, only question 1 addresses that, then there'll be the 3 sentences in the reading, or they'll hear 3 sentences, and then I will ask the question. And then I might do 3 more sentences, but now 2 questions are answered in those. So then it'll be like 3 sentences written, or I will say 3 sentences, and then I will say my 2 questions or 3 questions, whatever it is that goes with it. So I'm chunking it. So it's prompt, questions, prompt, questions, prompt, questions, to break it up for them. It's the same prompt that everybody else gets. I've just chunked it for them. And again, I don't do it for every student. I don't do it for every kid, or both of them for every kid. If they have auditory issues, it's the listening. If they have text issues, it's the reading. If they have both, it's both. And they just put the headphones on and they listen to their separate recording. A third thing I do, and that's another modification because I'm modifying the assessment from the original. The third way that I often do it is I will simplify the questions. Some kids get confused with more than 2 choices. So having a multiple choice with 3 or 4 or even 5 choices is too much. But true and false can be tricky, because if there's one aspect of it that makes the statement false, they don't always notice that. So I'm working really hard not to make any tricky questions. They also have trouble with all of the above or none of the above, or circle all that apply. All of those things are very confusing to a lot of kids, especially those with 504s or IEPs. So I eliminate all of those types of questions. And then I will simplify the questions to where there are only 2 choices and not necessarily true and false. Like, what color is the bear? Orange or green? How did the kid go to school? Walked or took the bus? So I'm limiting the choices for them, so they only have 2 things to focus on. There's no tricks here. I'm not trying to trick them. where even unintentionally true and false, by their very nature, can be tricky. So I don't usually use true and false questions for them. I don't do the circle all that apply or all of the above or none of the above. I don't do any of those types because I really want to simplify and have them focus on those two, just the two choices. Now, how do I know which of these work best for my kids? That's where the conversation comes in. I'll ask them, which do you think would help you the most? Now, they may be wrong. So I'll give them the first quiz and, it didn't do so well. So then we try a different way the next time until we find out what works. But a lot of the time, 7 out of 10 or 8 out of 10, they know what they need to be successful. They'll tell you, and we can have this conversation, and then I can create an assessment that is the same assessment that I'm giving everybody else, but it's modified to help them be more successful than they would have if I had just given them the straight assessment. Another thing, I get a lot of people who tell me with timed writings because they get twice as much time, but that throws off all of my statistics. So what I tell the parents and the caseworker and the student is, I'm not giving you twice as much time because it is a timed assignment for everybody. And the reason it's timed is because I want to see how fast you can get the words out of your head and onto the paper. But where I will modify is if the expectation is in set time 100 words and they're supposed to get double time, I have the expectation. So the expectation would be 50 words for those kids, which, doing the math, and I'm not a math person, but it comes out the same. I also take into account that they might be slower writers. It's like I had a kid who had muscular dystrophy and didn't have as much control over his fingers as other kids did, so he wrote much more slowly. I took that into account. And I might not even count anything in the word count for those students, depending on the situation. I had a kid who was really bad at spelling. It was more than just spelling issues. He had an IEP on it. He had a problem with phonetics. And so they were really focusing, this was high school, they were really focusing with him on the English phonetics. He was a native Spanish speaker, but here in America, he was not going to need to have to read and write in Spanish. Let's be honest, he didn't need to. He could already communicate orally in Spanish, and that was good enough. But I had him in Heritage Speakers Spanish class. I did not want to mess up his American phonetics and phonemes, so I did not teach him the Spanish ones. I did not worry about the Spanish spelling at all. But his spelling was so bad that I could not understand it. It wasn't like native speakers using American letters and sounds to write Spanish. It went way beyond that. He did not have a basic understanding of phonemes in either language. So, how did I get around that? He still wrote for me. But I had him read out loud what he wrote. He could read what he wrote, and it came out in Spanish when he did it. So, whatever he wrote, when he said it, it came out in Spanish. So, I didn't count spelling at all for this kid, and I just listened to what he told me, knowing that he's reading from his writing, and I would assess it that way. So you might exclude spelling from a writing assessment. Speaking assessment, some kids have extreme phobias of public speaking. So I still go with the least idea, the least amount of accommodation. So I'll have the kid turn around and face the wall. So they're not looking at anybody when they're speaking. They're facing the wall. If that doesn't work, I'll have them just come and talk to me privately. If that still doesn't work, then I'll have them come in before, after, or during lunch to come and do it privately. They're not going to get out of speaking because that's one of my 4 standards. I have to be able to assess it. But the rubrics and the standard does not say that it has to be public speaking where everybody can watch. So I make the accommodations as needed. I'm sure there's other accommodations I make. I just can't think of any off the top of my head. But if you guys have any ideas or things that you do, please share in the comments. It could trigger some ideas for me, or it might be something new for me that I'm not aware of, or I hadn't thought of, or that it's a great, amazing idea. While you're thinking about that, I'll tell you one activity that my level 3s are doing. We started this year at our campus what's called a kindness campus. It's something our principal came up with, and we're working really hard to make our campus as friendly and kind as possible. And one of the things that I know my campus is lacking, we have kids that are in special day classes, so they're restricted. They have severe disabilities, both mentally and physically. And so they are in confined classrooms. They stay in all day except for PE. They sometimes will come out to the main campus for lunch, but not always. They often can sit in their classrooms and eat. And they also have a fenced-in area, a little picnic area with a little bit of a playground where they can also eat too. I teach middle school right now. So these are middle school 6th, 7th, and 8th grade students. But they're very isolated, except for PE. They're pretty much isolated from the regular campus. And I wanted a way to incorporate this kindness campus idea, incorporate Spanish, and incorporate mixing regular ed kids with these special needs kids so they can see how these kids struggle and what great attitudes these kids have, and how these kids are not much different from themselves despite their disabilities that they have. And so what we're doing is we are choosing familiar children's books that are available in English, and most kids would have read in English, but are in Spanish. And then my 3s were going in once a month, and they're choosing a book, and they're taking turns reading the book to the kids. If the class is a bigger one, usually there are only like 6 or 7 in each one. They can break it up into 2 groups. There's 2 groups reading at the same time in different parts of the classroom. Or we can do 1, but I have kids take turns reading pages. In the beginning, they're just reading, like talking about the pictures. Oh, look, there's a bear. It's a big fat bear. It's a yellow bear. His name is Winnie the Pooh. And then flip the page. So it just depends on the book. But what it's doing, it's bringing connections of the special needs kids with the regular ed kids. And it allows them to connect and learn from each other. And the special needs kids absolutely love being read to. Even though they might not understand the language, they're getting some of the language because we're being really deliberate in what we do. Karina says, do you ask students with computer privileges to write in their composition notebook? I'm at a loss. I want to use your notebook idea, but I have some students who do not write on paper. Do you mean because of a disability they don't write on paper? Yes, okay. So you can make a digital. So what I would do Like I had a student, again in a wheelchair, who really preferred to type because his dexterity in his fingers was just not good. Normally, I would never allow a kid to type a quick write because, number one, they don't know how the accents work. Number two, you can usually type much faster than you can handwrite. So it's kind of like an unfair advantage. But in that particular case, we let it go. But for a notebook, you could have them do a digital notebook just for them. And what you would do is I would create not a Google Doc, because that's only really, you can't do much with graphics when you have pictures and stuff that you need to do. So what I would do is create a Google slide. And you go into the Google Slides and you go into Edit Page Options and you change the size of the slide to 8.5 by 11 inches. So now it looks like a sheet of paper. And then you can make your some title pages in there for each of the sections that you want. And then the kid can add the pages in between as you go along. So like for our word of the day, they would add a page under the morphema section. They would add a page and they will type in their morphemes. The reflection section, so under reflexiones, there you made the title page, they would add a page underneath and they would add text to type that in. And so they will still have their digital composition book, but it will be digital to accommodate for their disability, that they can't use pencil and paper. And that will also allow them, when we do more creative things with it, that they can take clip art instead of drawing. They can find clip art and paste it in there. And you just have much more control with the placement of text, the placement of shapes, and the placement of images on Google Sheets than you do Google Docs. So I prefer to use Google Docs for that. The only thing I use Google Sheets. I'm not Sheets, Slides. I'm mixing them all up. Google Slides, the slide deck. The only thing I let kids use Google Docs for is if they're writing like a composition, an essay for me, which we don't almost ever do. We have a couple IB, now what's the word? IB units and the assessment that goes along with that they have to write a story, and I teach them how to use the keyboard in Spanish, and they'll type that out and then turn that into our learning management system. But other than that, all the stuff I have them do is by handwriting. But that's the only thing I would use Google Docs for, because Google Docs is really for text and text alone. But there's a lot more stuff that I do with the notebook. So a creative one using Google Slides really, really works. And if you like, Karina says, this is great. Thank you. I love the idea. You're welcome. Now, and also you may find that creating a Google slide deck notebook works better for everybody. And if it's a one-to-one classroom where everybody has access to a device, then you might have them, instead of do it on paper and pencil, do it all digitally. That's another option. And then you make it for everybody. Sometimes that's easier. I am trying to go as much digital as possible. I don't give out copies of things anymore. Why? Because I want to save the paper. Most of the kids just toss the things away. And we only use a lot of the stuff for a very limited amount of time. So the only copies I make are my quick write papers for once a week. But anything else I try to do digitally. My kids don't even turn their notebooks into me to grade. They keep them. They will take a picture of the page that I need to assess and turn it into our learning management system. So we're not having all this paper going back and forth. It started with COVID, where we weren't supposed to exchange papers back and forth. I couldn't touch papers from kids and they couldn't touch papers from me. But it turned into, we can save the overall environment. Think about how many copies and papers we make, and then how many of them just end up in the trash. And so if this works for you and you like the digital, you can do this. Have them, you create a template of all the things that you want in it. You have them make a copy of it so they have their own, and they will write their name as the name of the document. And then you make sure that they share it with you, that you have viewing and commenting rights so you can comment on the pages. That's an awesome idea to do if you don't mind doing it digitally and you like doing it digitally and you don't have to worry about the paper transfer back and forth. And kids can get really creative. They don't have to glue things in for an interactive notebook. They can, take a screenshot of something and paste it into their digital notebook. So this is another way that you can make an accommodation for your students. And I'll tell you, just made me think of one that I do too. I don't do this for everybody because one of the problems I had as a high school teacher having middle school kids come in was that middle school kids were always coddled. They were always handheld all the way through middle school and never learned to be self-reliant. And in high school, we didn't do that anymore, and they either sank or swam. So I want teach my kids to be as self-sufficient as possible. I don't want to hold all their hands. Like some of my co-teachers will, they do notebooks, but they have them all the kids keep all of their notebooks in the classroom so they don't lose them. Well, that's holding their hand. When they get to high school, that's not gonna happen. So they need to be responsible for it before that. But I have kids that I know that are not responsible, that won't be responsible. And so for those kids, I invite them to put them in the special spot in the back of my room so they always know where their notebook is, because they'll never need it at home. We only use it in class. And if it goes between their desk to the backpack to outside the classroom to home, it doesn't always come back. So for those kids, just leave it in the back so they have access to it whenever they need it. And I never have to worry about that. That's an accommodation. It's not a modification. But I will do that for certain kids, but not all of them. Any other ideas or questions that we have about our wonderful special needs kids? And I'll tell you, I absolutely love autistic kids. They are some of my favorite kids. And my sister taught special needs in special needs elementary school for many, many years. And then she switched over to regular ed kindergarten. But I just love those kids to death. I love the attitudes that they have. They have, so many of them have such great attitudes despite all the issues that they have. And it just makes some of us stop and think, or it should make us stop and think about how lucky we are, and maybe the things that we're complaining about, we shouldn't complain about as much. And I always have an affection for underdogs. I love those kind of movies. I love those kind of stories. I love underdogs. Okay, well, if there's nothing else, I don't have anything for you. If you're going to watch this on the replay, please feel free to ask any questions. Add your ideas to the comment section. I will go back and go over those. And if no one else has anything else, I will say goodbye for this week. I'm not sure what our topic will be next week, but we'll be back on Monday, 3:30 p.m. Pacific time. And I hope all of you have an incredible week, and I will see you next time. Thank you so much. Goodbye, everybody. Natalie says, thank you so much for this video series, Scott. You are so welcome. I'm glad you're finding it helpful.